He was a man who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, a titan of industry, whose name was whispered with a mixture of awe and fear. She was a woman serving canapés to pay for textbooks on quantum mechanics, a ghost in the grand theater of the elite. On a rain-slicked Tuesday night at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, these two worlds didn't just meet, they collided. A spilled glass of priceless Chateau Margaux became the catalyst for a chain of events no one could have predicted. It's a story about power intellect, and the moment a rude billionaire learned that the most valuable assets can't be bought, and sometimes the quietest person in the room is the most powerful one of all. The air in Ethelred's on Park Row was thick with the scent of money and truffle oil. It was a cathedral of modern cuisine where conversations were conducted in hushed, important tones, and the clinking of cutlery was a delicate symphony. For Sophie Walsh, it was just another 8-hour shift on her feet. Her mind, usually occupied with complex astrophysical equations and the maddening intricacies of stellar nucleosynthesis, was focused on the mundane keeping water glasses full, remembering who ordered the scallops and maintaining the practiced invisible smile of a professional waitress. Her life was a study in contrasts. By day, she was a scholarship student at Northwood University, wrestling with concepts that stretched the very fabric of reality. By night, she wore a starched black uniform and navigated the orbits of New York's financial elite, earning the tips that paid for her rent and ramen noodle dinners. She was good at her job because she was a keen observer, a skill honed by staring at distant galaxies. She could read a table's mood from a dropped shoulder or a tightened jaw predicting their needs before they were spoken. Tonight, Table 7 was a supernova waiting to happen. The man at its center was Declan Rutherford. Even if you didn't know his name, you knew his type. His suit was a bespoke creation from Savile Row that probably cost more than her entire year's tuition. His watch, a Patek Philippe, was a subtle but potent declaration of his status. He wasn't loud or boisterous. His power was a quiet, crushing gravity that pulled all the attention in the room towards him. He radiated a cold, intense energy, his jaw tight as he intermittently glanced at his phone, his thumb swiping with brutal efficiency. His two dinner companions sat in nervous silence, picking at their food like birds near a predator. Sophie had been warned about him by the manager, Mr. Dubois. Table 7 is Mr. Rutherford, Rutherford Innovations. Whatever he wants, he gets. No mistakes. For 2 hours, the dinner had been tense but uneventful. Sophie moved with practiced grace, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, a silent phantom in his peripheral vision. The wine was a 1982 Chateau Margaux, a bottle that cost more than her car. She handled it with the reverence of a museum curator handling a delicate artifact. The moment of impact came without warning. Declan's phone buzzed violently on the polished mahogany. He snatched it up, his face darkening as he read the screen. A low curse escaped his lips. "That incompetent fool," he snarled, not to his guests but to the universe at large. It was at that exact second that Sophie leaned in to top off his wine glass. Distracted and furious, he gestured dismissively, his hand sweeping out in a sharp, angry arc. His knuckles connected squarely with her wrist. Time seemed to slow down. The bottle of crimson liquid tilted a graceful, horrifying parabola of liquid potential energy converting to kinetic. It wasn't a splash, it was a deluge. The deep ruby-red wine cascaded down the front of Sophie's crisp white shirt, a shocking stain that felt both ice-cold and burning hot against her skin. A collective gasp went through the nearby tables. The symphony of cutlery stopped. For a heartbeat, there was absolute silence. Then Declan Rutherford looked up his icy blue eyes, finally focusing on her for the first time all night. There was no apology in them, only annoyance. "Watch where you're going." He snapped his voice a low, dangerous growl. He didn't look at her soaked uniform. He looked at the few drops that had dared to splash onto the tablecloth near his plate. His dinner guest, a man named Peterson, stammered, "Declan, it was your hand." "I'm aware of what my hand did." Declan cut him off his glare, silencing the man instantly. He turned that glare back to Sophie. "Well, are you just going to stand there dripping all over the floor? Clean this up." The humiliation was a physical blow. Her skin burned. Her ears rang. Every eye in the restaurant was on her, a specimen under a microscope. Mr. Dubois was already rushing over his face, a mask of panicked apology aimed entirely at Declan. "Mr. Rutherford, I am so terribly sorry. So sorry. This is unacceptable. Her wages will be docked for the cost of the cleaning. Miss Walsh, go to the back immediately." But Sophie didn't move. Something inside her, a part of her that had spent years solving problems infinitely more complex than this petty tyrant, refused to be dismissed like a faulty piece of equipment. She looked directly at Declan Rutherford, her gaze not defiant, but analytical. Her mind, her greatest asset, took over. She calmly placed the now empty bottle back on the table. She ignored Mr. Dubois' frantic hissing. Her voice when she spoke was quiet, but carried a strange, clear authority that cut through the tension. "The fault wasn't a matter of inattention, sir," she said, her tone even. "It was a matter of predictable physics." Declan stared at her, momentarily taken aback by the response. He had expected tears, or a flustered apology, or sullen silence. He had not expected a lecture. "What did you just say to me? The angular momentum of your arm, accelerated by your emotional response to your phone notification, created a vector of force that my compensatory motion was insufficient to counter," she explained, as if discussing a lab experiment. "Given the viscosity of the fluid and the gravitational pull, the resulting spill pattern was inevitable. It wasn't carelessness. It was cause and effect." A stunned silence fell over the table. Peterson's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth. Declan Rutherford looked at her as if she had just started speaking in ancient Greek. His anger was being replaced by a baffling sense of confusion. Sophie picked up a clean linen napkin. She then took a pen from her apron pocket. On the pristine white cloth, she began to write. Not words, but an equation. A short, elegant string of symbols. It was a differential equation, modeling chaotic motion, a little piece of the complex theories she worked on in her spare time. It was a purely instinctive act of defiance, a way of communicating in the only language she felt truly powerful in. She placed the napkin on the table next to his plate. "A simple predictive model," she said softly. "Perhaps you can use it to anticipate future accidents." With that, she turned her back straight and walked away from the table, leaving behind a stunned billionaire, two bewildered guests, a horrified manager, and a napkin that held more than just a mathematical formula. It held a challenge, and Declan Rutherford had never in his entire life backed down from a challenge. The walk to the staff locker room was the longest of Sophie's life. The adrenaline that had sharpened her mind and steadied her voice began to recede, replaced by a cold, trembling dread. What had she just done? She hadn't just talked back to a customer. She had talked back to the customer. A man who could probably buy the entire city block and have it bulldozed for a parking lot if he felt like it. Her co-worker Brendan, a perpetually cheerful drama student, met her by the lockers, his eyes wide. "Soph, are you insane? I heard everything. The entire dining room is buzzing. Predictable physics." "Who says that?" "I did, apparently," Sophie mumbled, peeling off the soaked, stained shirt. The wine had seeped through to her skin, cold and sticky. She felt profoundly violated. "Dubois looks like he's about to have a stroke," Brendan continued, handing her a spare uniform shirt. "He's probably composing your termination letter on a cocktail napkin right now. But man, you should have seen Rutherford's face. It was like a computer trying to process a paradox." Sophie sank onto a bench, her head in her hands. "I don't know why I did it, Bren. He was just so dismissive. Like I wasn't even a person. Like I was just an obstacle. And the equation, God, that was so stupid." "No, it was epic," Brendan insisted. "It was like something out of a movie. The brilliant, underestimated heroine puts the arrogant tycoon in his place with the power of math." Sophie couldn't share his enthusiasm. She was thinking about her rent, her tuition payment that was due next month, the looming cost of new textbooks. Ethelred's paid well for a waiting job, and she couldn't afford to lose it. She had just jeopardized her entire, fragile stability for a moment of intellectual pride. As predicted, Mr. Dubois fired her before she could even clock out. He was apologetic, but firm. "I have no choice, Sophie. Mr. Rutherford is one of our most important patrons. We can't risk offending him. I'm sorry." He didn't sound sorry. He sounded scared. Walking home through the damp New York streets, the city lights blurring through her tired eyes, Sophie felt the full weight of her actions crush her. She lived in a tiny fifth-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that was generously described as up and coming. Her apartment was less a home and more a library with a bed in it. Stacks of books on theoretical physics, astrophysics and computational modeling covered every available surface. Her prized possession was a second-hand, high-powered telescope she'd saved for 2 years to buy crammed awkwardly into her single window. It was her escape, her portal to a universe that was vast, orderly, and made sense in a way her life on Earth often didn't. Tonight, that universe felt very far away. Meanwhile, back at Ethelred's, Declan Rutherford was still staring at the napkin. The dinner had ended abruptly. His guests, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, had made their excuses and left. He had dismissed Mr. Dubois's groveling apologies with an impatient wave. Now he was alone at the table, the remnants of a $5,000 dinner forgotten. He was a man who dealt in data, in absolutes, in predictable market forces and exploitable patterns. His company, Rutherford Innovations, was at the forefront of satellite communications technology, a field built on the elegant certainty of physics. And this waitress, this girl with ink stains on her fingers and a defiant spark in her eyes, had just used his own language against him. He wasn't an idiot. He had a degree in aerospace engineering from MIT. He recognized the notation on the napkin. It wasn't just random scribbles. It was a legitimate, albeit simplified model for chaotic dynamics. It was witty, it was insolent, and it was brilliant. But it wasn't just the equation that haunted him. It was her composure. The way she had analyzed the situation with such detached clarity in the face of his raw, unchecked anger. No one stood up to him like that. His employees feared him. His rivals respected him, and the world fawned over him. No one had ever looked him in the eye and calmly explained that his temper tantrum was a predictable variable. His mind flashed back to a snippet of conversation he'd had on the phone just before the spill, a conversation about the very problem that was consuming his company. They were losing a multi-billion-dollar contract because the guidance systems on their new satellite network, the Helios constellation, were failing. The satellite's orbits were decaying unpredictably, minute deviations that were compounding over time, making their communication links unreliable. His top engineers, the best minds money could buy, were stumped. They blamed solar flares, gravitational anomalies, a dozen unpredictable factors. They called it unavoidable stochastic interference. And a waitress had just handed him an equation for predicting chaotic motion. The coincidence was too great to ignore. He stood up, leaving a black credit card on the table. He carefully folded the linen napkin and placed it in the inside pocket of his suit jacket. As he walked out into the cool night air, his mind was racing. His anger had completely evaporated, replaced by an insatiable, burning curiosity. He got into the back of his waiting town car and pulled out his phone. He didn't call his office. He called a different number. "Gabriel," he said when the call was answered. "I have a task for you. I need you to find someone. Her name is Sophie Walsh. She was a waitress at Ethelred's on Park Row. Note the past tense. I want to know everything about her, where she lives, where she goes to school, what she studies. Everything. And I want the information on my desk by morning." In his sterile, minimalist penthouse overlooking Central Park, Declan couldn't sleep. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering cityscape spread out before him like a circuit board. He took the napkin from his pocket and smoothed it out on a glass table. The equation stared back at him, a silent taunt. He wasn't just intrigued by the girl. He was haunted by her. In her calm, analytical gaze, he had seen a flicker of a mind that worked like his own, but without the cynical, brutal armor he had built around himself over the years. For the first time in a very long time, Declan Rutherford had been surprised, and he was determined to understand why. 2 days later, Sophie was living in a state of anxious limbo. The initial panic had subsided into a grim determination. She had already started her job search, scouring online listings for restaurants, coffee shops, and tutoring gigs. Each application felt like a small defeat, a step away from the academic world she so desperately wanted to join permanently. She was sitting in the university's main library, the vast sunlit hall, a sanctuary of quiet thought. She was trying to immerse herself in a paper on quantum entanglement, but her mind kept drifting. The memory of Declan Rutherford's cold, dismissive face was a discordant note that interrupted her concentration. "Miss Walsh, Sophie Walsh." The voice was deep and calm, with no place in the library's hushed reverence. Sophie looked up from her textbook. Standing beside her table was a man who was as out of place here as a raven in a flock of sparrows. He was tall and impeccably dressed in a simple dark suit with a stoic, unreadable expression. He looked less like a student and more like a Secret Service agent. "Yes," Sophie answered, her guard immediately up. "My name is Gabriel. I work for Mr. Declan Rutherford." Sophie's blood ran cold. This was it. He was suing her for the cost of the wine, or for slander, or for some other trumped-up charge only a billionaire's legal team could invent. She started mentally calculating how much debt she would be in for the rest of her life. "I'm here to deliver a message," Gabriel continued, his voice low and professional. "Mr. Rutherford was impressed by your analysis of the situation the other night. He would like to arrange a meeting with you to discuss it further." Sophie stared at him, bewildered. "A meeting to discuss what physics I was fired? I assumed that was the end of it." The termination of your employment was an unfortunate consequence of your manager's overzealousness, not a directive from Mr. Rutherford," Gabriel said smoothly. "Mr. Rutherford believes your particular insights could be of value." He slid a sleek black envelope across the table. Sophie hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a heavy cardstock invitation. It proposed a meeting the following afternoon at the Rutherford Innovations building downtown. At the bottom, a line was typed in small, crisp font. "A consulting fee of $5,000 will be provided for your time contingent on the signing of a non-disclosure agreement." $5,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering like a mirage. It was more than 2 months' rent. It would cover her textbooks for the entire year. It was a lifeline, but it felt like a trap. "Why?" Sophie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What could I possibly have to offer a man like him?" "That is what Mr. Rutherford wishes to determine." Gabriel replied, his expression unchanging. "He found your napkin intriguing." The napkin. The ridiculous, impulsive equation. She felt a flush of embarrassment followed by a surge of suspicion. This had to be a joke or a trick. Billionaires didn't summon fired waitresses for consultations based on a drunken scrawl. Except he hadn't been drunk. He'd been angry. And the equation hadn't been a scrawl. It had been precise. "I study astrophysics," she said, feeling a strange need to defend herself, to prove she was more than the uniform he'd seen her in. It was just a theoretical model. "Mr. Rutherford has a degree in aerospace engineering. He understood the theory," Gabriel said. For the first time, a flicker of something, perhaps respect, showed in his eyes. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. A car will be waiting for you outside the university's main gate. The decision, of course, is yours." He gave a slight, formal nod and walked away, his polished shoes making no sound on the library floor. Sophie was left with the envelope in her hand, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. This was insane. She spent the rest of the day in a haze of indecision. She called Brendan, who was ecstatic. "You have to go," he urged. "This is your superhero origin story." By day, brilliant physics student. By night, she's the equationator or something, solving crimes against good service. Seriously. "Soph, what do you have to lose? You're already fired." He had a point. Her rational mind, the part of her that calculated risks and probabilities, began to take over. The worst-case scenario, she gets humiliated again, but walks away with $5,000 after signing the NDA, of course. The best-case scenario, she couldn't even begin to imagine what that would be. Her curiosity, the driving force of her scientific mind, began to outweigh her fear. What problem could a man like Declan Rutherford have that he thought a waitress/student could solve the next day at 1:55 p.m.? Sophie stood outside the university gates, feeling horribly out of place. She had worn her best clothes, a simple pair of dark trousers and a clean pressed blouse. It felt woefully inadequate. Exactly at 2 o'clock, a black, silent sedan that looked more like a stealth bomber than a car pulled up to the curb. The back door was opened by a driver in a crisp uniform. Swallowing her nerves, Sophie got in. The ride downtown was a journey into another world. The car glided through traffic, insulated from the city's noise. They pulled up in front of the Rutherford Innovations Tower, a soaring skyscraper of black glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. It was a monument to power and ambition. Gabriel was waiting for her in the lobby, a cavernous space of marble and chrome. "Welcome, Miss Walsh. Mr. Rutherford is expecting you." He led her to a private elevator that shot upwards with stomach-lurching speed. They stepped out into a penthouse-level office suite. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic vista of the entire city. But Sophie barely noticed it. Her attention was fixed on the man standing by the window, his back to her. Declan Rutherford turned around. He wasn't wearing a suit jacket now, just a stark white shirt with the sleeves rolled up his forearms. He looked younger, more intense and somehow more dangerous than he had in the restaurant. His blue eyes scanned her, and this time his gaze wasn't dismissive. It was sharp, calculating, and intensely focused. "Miss Walsh," he said, his voice the same low, resonant timbre she remembered. "Thank you for coming. I believe we have a mutual interest in the practical applications of chaotic dynamics." On the massive conference table between them, laid out under a spotlight, was the linen napkin from Ethelred's. The conference room felt less like an office and more like a command center. One wall was a screen displaying complex telemetry data and orbital plots. The air hummed with the quiet power of cutting-edge technology, and in the center of it all was the absurdly out-of-place linen napkin. Sophie stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated by the opulence or the man commanding it. "Mr. Rutherford, I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here." "You're here," Declan said, walking from the window to the table. "Because of this." He gestured to the napkin. "This equation you scribbled as a parting gift. It's a model for predicting behavior in a non-linear system, correct? A very basic one, yes?" Sophie confirmed, her voice steady. "It's a foundational concept in chaos theory. My engineers, the ones I pay millions of dollars a year, keep telling me that the orbital decay of my new Helios satellite constellation is unpredictable. They use words like stochastic and random. They've given up on prediction and are focusing on correction, which is inefficient, costly, and failing." He said, his words clipped and precise. He pointed to the screen, which now showed a simulation of dozens of small satellites. A few of them, colored red, were slowly drifting from their ideal orbital paths. "They're looking at the problem from the wrong perspective," Declan continued, his eyes fixed on her. "They see chaos and throw up their hands. You saw chaos and you wrote an equation. Explain that." The pieces clicked into place for Sophie. This wasn't about the spilled wine. This was a test. A very strange, very high-stakes job interview. She took a deep breath. "They're not wrong, exactly. In a truly chaotic system, you can't predict the long-term state with perfect accuracy. That's the butterfly effect. But you can model the boundaries of the chaos. You can map the strange attractor within which the system will evolve. You're not predicting the exact position of a satellite in 3 months. You're predicting the probable shape of its path. It's about probabilities, not certainties." She walked closer to the screen, her academic instincts taking over. "What are the primary variables causing the decay? Are we talking atmospheric drag? Gravitational anomalies from lunar and solar cycles, solar radiation pressure?" Declan gestured for her to continue, a look of intense concentration on his face. He was listening, truly listening. "The standard models are too simple," Sophie theorized, thinking aloud. "They treat these forces as separate inputs, but they're not. They're interconnected. A solar flare increases radiation pressure, which also affects the upper atmosphere's density, which in turn magnifies drag, but not uniformly across the whole constellation. It's a feedback loop, a non-linear system. The problem isn't one variable. It's the interplay between all of them." She turned back to him. "Your engineers are trying to solve a dozen separate math problems. They need to be solving one much more complex, unified one." For a long moment, Declan was silent. He studied her, his gaze piercing. He had asked the same question to his head of engineering, a man with 30 years of experience and a PhD from Caltech. That man had given him a 2-hour presentation filled with jargon and excuses. This young woman in a simple blouse had explained it more clearly in 2 minutes than his entire team had in 2 months. "Show me," Declan said, his voice a low command. He pointed to a secondary console, a sleek touchscreen interface. "The raw telemetry data is there. Show me what you mean by a unified model." Sophie hesitated. This was the precipice. Behind her was her life of ramen and textbooks. In front of her was a world she couldn't comprehend. She thought of the $5,000 consulting fee. She could just take the money and walk away. But the problem was beautiful. It was a puzzle of cosmic proportions, the kind of thing she dreamed of solving. She sat down at the console. Her fingers, hesitant at first, began to fly across the screen, bringing up data streams, cross-referencing orbital paths with solar flare activity logs and gravitational field maps. The world outside the problem faded away. It was just her, the data, and the elegant, hidden pattern she knew was there. For the next hour, she didn't speak. She worked her mind lit up with the fire of true intellectual engagement. Declan stood behind her, watching in silence. He saw not a waitress, but a first-rate analytical mind at work. He saw the way she instinctively linked disparate datasets, the way she built a framework for a new simulation with a speed and intuition that was staggering. Finally, Sophie stopped. She had created a rough preliminary framework. It was far from a solution, but it was a new way of looking at the problem. "It's a start," she said, her voice tired but energized. "You'd need to run this through a supercomputer, refine the variables. But it should give you a probabilistic forecast, not a deterministic one. It'll show you which satellites are at the highest risk of deviation and within what parameters. It can make your corrections predictive instead of reactive." Declan walked around the table and looked at the model she had built. A slow, almost imperceptible nod was his only reaction. But to anyone who knew him, it was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "The non-disclosure agreement," he said, gesturing to a thin folder on the table that Sophie hadn't noticed. "Gabriel will walk you through it. I want you to work with my engineering team. I will pay you a consulting fee of $10,000 a week until the problem is solved." Sophie's head spun. $10,000 a week. It was a laughable, life-altering amount of money. "But my classes," she stammered. "My studies." "We'll work around your schedule," Declan said dismissively, as if arranging university timetables was a trivial matter, which for him it probably was. "You'll have full access to our resources, our data, our labs, our people. All I want is the solution." Then his expression shifted. A shadow of something more personal crossed his face. "One more thing. What happened at the restaurant? My behavior was unacceptable. There's no excuse for it." It wasn't a warm apology, but it was direct, unflinching, and Sophie sensed cost him a great deal to say. It was an admission of fallibility from a man who likely never admitted to any. "Thank you," Sophie said quietly, accepting the apology. As Gabriel entered to handle the paperwork, Declan turned to look back out the window. He was a man on the brink of a corporate disaster. A rival company, Vance Dynamics, run by the notoriously ruthless Lorraine Vance, was circling ready to pick up the multi-billion-dollar government contract the moment his Helios network was officially declared a failure. The pressure on him was immense. He had built his empire on the promise of flawless innovation, and he was about to be undone by a few stray solar winds. He had hired this girl out of a desperate, long-shot hunch. But as he watched her speak to Gabriel, her expression serious and intelligent as she read over the legal document, he realized it might be the single best business decision he had ever made. He had been looking for a solution in his labs and boardrooms, but he may have just found it in the most unlikely of places, serving him wine at table 7. Sophie's life transformed overnight. She was an anomaly, a ghost in the machine of Rutherford Innovations. She didn't have a formal title or a designated office. Instead, she was given a security pass that granted her access to the R&D labs on the 48th floor, a sterile, hushed environment where some of the brightest minds in the industry worked. The first few days were a trial by fire. Declan's engineering team, led by a veteran engineer named Dr. Peterson, the same nervous man from the dinner, treated her with a mixture of awe and deep-seated suspicion. They had been briefed by Declan himself, told only that Miss Walsh was a specialist consultant with a unique perspective. They saw a young woman barely out of her teens, dressed in jeans and a university sweatshirt, who had somehow become their boss's pet project. The resentment was palpable. They would listen to her suggestions in meetings with polite, blank expressions, only to dismiss them the moment she left the room. They saw her as a curiosity, a savant perhaps, but not a real engineer. Sophie, however, was not interested in their approval. She was interested in the data. Declan had given her unfettered access, and she dove into the raw satellite telemetry like a pearl diver. She worked around her class schedule, often arriving at the tower late in the afternoon, and working deep into the night, long after the regular employees had gone home. It was during these quiet hours that she and Declan began to form an unusual, unspoken partnership. He was a notorious workaholic, and was almost always in his penthouse office. He would often come down to the labs around midnight, finding her surrounded by glowing screens, a half-empty coffee cup by her side. He wouldn't say much at first. He would just watch, observing her process. But soon he began to ask questions, not just about the project, but about her studies. "What's the subject of your thesis?" he asked one night, leaning against a console. "The potential for detecting exotic matter signatures in the accretion disks of supermassive black holes," she replied, without looking up from her screen. Declan was silent for a moment. "So looking for needles in a cosmic haystack?" "Something like that." She smiled faintly. "It makes this satellite problem seem almost manageable." This became their routine. He would bring her coffee. She would explain her latest breakthrough in the model. He would challenge her assumptions, pushing her, debating her, treating her not as an employee, but as an intellectual peer. In these late-night sessions, stripped of the corporate hierarchy, the rude billionaire from the restaurant vanished. In his place was a man who was brilliant-driven and possessed a deep, almost boyish passion for the physics that underpinned his empire. Sophie, in turn, began to see past his abrasive exterior. She saw the immense pressure he was under, the weight of the thousands of jobs and the future of technology that rested on his shoulders. She also saw a profound loneliness in him, the isolation of a man who stood at the top of a mountain. One evening, as they worked on a particularly stubborn piece of the simulation, he shared a rare glimpse into his past. "My father was an engineer," he said, staring at the screen, but seeing something else entirely. He believed emotion was a flaw in the system, a bug to be patched. Success was the only acceptable output. Anything else was a rounding error. Sophie understood him a little better then. His rudeness wasn't just arrogance. It was a learned behavior, a shield forged in a childhood devoid of warmth. As Sophie's predictive model grew more sophisticated, it began to yield results. It started correctly forecasting minor orbital deviations 24 hours in advance, then 48. Soon the team could anticipate and correct for shifts a week before they happened. The unavoidable stochastic interference was becoming predictable. The attitude of the engineering team began to shift. Suspicion turned to grudging respect, then to outright admiration. They started seeking her out, asking for her input, including her in their core discussions. Dr. Peterson even apologized to her privately. "I've been working in this field for 30 years, Miss Walsh. I've never seen anyone approach a problem like you do. It's humbling." Sophie was finally in her element. The $10,000 a week was life-changing, allowing her to quit her other part-time jobs and focus completely on her studies and this project. But the real payment was the work itself. This was what she was born to do. Her relationship with Declan was also evolving. The professional respect was now tinged with a delicate, unspoken personal connection. There was an intellectual chemistry between them that was more potent than any physical attraction. They finished each other's sentences in technical discussions, anticipated each other's logical leaps. One Friday night, after a major breakthrough, they found themselves the last two people in the entire R&D department. The city lights twinkled below. "We should celebrate," Declan said suddenly. "You've done in 3 weeks what my team couldn't do in 3 months." He didn't suggest a fancy restaurant. Instead, he led her to the building's rooftop helipad. A helicopter was waiting. They lifted off into the night sky, the city unfolding beneath them in a breathtaking tapestry of light. They didn't talk much during the flight. They just watched the world from a god's-eye view. He took her to a small private observatory he owned upstate. It was a simple dome with a powerful research-grade telescope, a far cry from her clumsy instrument back in her apartment. For the first time, Sophie saw Declan truly relax. As he talked about the constellations, about the challenges of deep space imaging, the ruthless CEO disappeared and the MIT-trained engineer with a love for the stars emerged. She looked at him, his face illuminated by the soft red light of the observatory's instruments, and felt a strange, unexpected pull. This man who had humiliated her just weeks ago was now showing her the universe. But as their new partnership solidified, a shadow was lengthening. Lorraine Vance, the CEO of Vance Dynamics, was growing impatient. The government contract was still up for grabs, and she had expected Rutherford Innovations to have collapsed by now. Her sources inside the company told her they were on the verge of a breakthrough led by some mysterious new consultant. Lorraine was not a woman who liked to lose. She decided it was time to stop playing fair and introduce her own chaotic variable into the system. And she knew just where to strike. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday. After weeks of refinement, Sophie's model, which the team had affectionately nicknamed Cassandra because it could see the future, was finally ready for its full-scale test. It was designed to run a 6-month predictive simulation of the entire Helios constellation, accounting for every variable she had built into it. If it worked, it would not only save the current network, but would form the basis for all future satellite guidance systems at the company. It would be a paradigm shift in the industry. The mood in the control room was electric. The entire senior engineering team was present, along with Sophie and Declan, who stood at the back watching with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but radiating intense focus. Sophie initiated the simulation. The supercomputer's processors whirred to life, crunching trillions of calculations per second. On the main screen, 6 months of data began to unfold in a matter of minutes. The first month passed flawlessly. The second, the third. The model was predicting orbital paths with an astonishing 99.8% accuracy. A wave of relief and quiet celebration rippled through the room. And then it happened. At the 4-month, 3-week mark in the simulation, a catastrophic error cascaded through the system. A single satellite, Helios 7, suddenly veered wildly off course, its projected path sending it into a collision course with 3 other satellites. The entire network collapsed into a mess of red warning lights and collision alerts. The simulation had failed. A stunned, horrified silence descended upon the room. All eyes turned to Sophie. The model was her creation. The failure was hers. What the hell was that? Dr. Peterson breathed, his face pale. The inputs were perfect. It doesn't make any sense. Run it again, Declan commanded, his voice tight. They did, and again. The result was the same. At the exact same point in the simulation, Helios 7 went rogue, triggering a chain reaction of failures. There must be a bug in my code, Sophie said, her mind racing, a cold knot of dread tightening in her stomach. A miscalculation in the feedback loop. For the next 48 hours, she worked without sleep, fueled by coffee and desperation. She dissected her model line by line, equation by equation. Declan stayed with her, a silent, grim presence. The pressure from the Department of Defense, the client for the contract, was mounting. The deadline for a solution was the end of the week. Vance Dynamics was already publicly questioning Rutherford Innovations' ability to deliver. The company's stock was plummeting. But Sophie could find nothing wrong with her math. The physics was sound. The code was elegant and efficient. There was no bug. That's impossible, Declan said when she told him. His patience, already worn thin by the stress, finally snapped. The cold, ruthless CEO returned with a vengeance. A system doesn't fail without a reason. You missed something. Some variable you didn't account for. I accounted for everything, Sophie insisted, her voice raw with exhaustion and frustration. Solar flares, gravitational lensing, atmospheric density shifts. It's all in there. The model is correct. Clearly, it's not. He shot back, his voice echoing in the empty lab. This elegant model of yours just cost me billions of dollars and possibly my entire company. The accusation hung in the air between them, sharp and poisonous. The trust they had built, the intellectual partnership, the fragile personal connection, it all shattered in that moment. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of the same dismissive anger from the restaurant. In a crisis, he had reverted to his default setting, blame the variable you don't understand. And she was the newest, most unknown variable in his system. Maybe you're right, she said, her voice hollow. Maybe I'm in over my head. She turned, picked up her bag, and walked out of the lab, leaving him standing alone amidst the screens displaying her catastrophic failure. The accusation wasn't just in his words. It was spreading through the company. Rumors began to fly. Who was this girl, anyway? The consultant who appeared out of nowhere. The one with no background, no security vetting. The one who was given complete access to their most sensitive project. The next morning, Declan was in a crisis meeting with his board when Gabriel entered and placed a tablet in front of him. On the screen was a highly encrypted file. It was an internal data transfer log. We found the anomaly, Gabriel said quietly. It wasn't in Miss Walsh's code. It was in the raw telemetry data being fed to her code. Declan's eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the log. He saw it instantly. A tiny packet of malicious code, a ghost in the machine, had been embedded deep within the data stream for Helios 7. It was designed to remain dormant until the simulation reached a specific future date, at which point it would introduce A single false velocity reading. A tiny nudge, imperceptible in the short term, but catastrophic over time. It was a brilliant, insidious piece of corporate sabotage. It wasn't a bug. Declan realized, a cold dread washing over him. It was a time bomb. The packet was uploaded from an internal workstation 2 days ago, Gabriel explained. We've traced the IP address. He showed Declan the result. The workstation belonged to Dr. Peterson. The betrayal was shocking, but the implication was worse. Declan had accused Sophie. He had let his fear and his anger override his logic. He had looked at the one person who had offered him a real solution and had seen only a scapegoat. The weight of his mistake was heavier than any financial loss. "Where is she?" Declan demanded, his voice low and urgent. "She left the building last night. Didn't answer her phone this morning. Her university professor, a Dr. Anya Sharma, said she called in sick to her classes today," Gabriel reported. Declan stood up, his face a mask of grim resolve. He had to find her. He had to apologize. But he knew a simple, "I'm sorry," wouldn't be enough. He had broken something far more valuable than a simulation. He had broken her trust. And with the wolves at the door and his company hanging by a thread, he was terrifyingly aware that he couldn't fix this mess without her. The world had shrunk back to the confines of Sophie's tiny apartment. The soaring Rutherford Tower, the endless streams of data, the thrill of the intellectual chase, it all felt like a fever dream. She was back in her reality of worn textbooks and a leaky faucet. She hadn't been sick. She had been wounded. Declan's accusation had cut deeper than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just that he'd doubted her work. He'd doubted her. After all their late-night conversations and shared moments of discovery, when the pressure mounted, he had seen her as nothing more than a liability. She ignored the incessant buzzing of her phone, knowing it was him. Instead, she stared at the complex star chart on her wall, finding a strange comfort in its predictable celestial mechanics. The universe was trustworthy. People she was learning were not. A firm, insistent knock on her door startled her. It wasn't Brendan's casual rap. This was different. She opened the door a crack, and her breath hitched. Declan Rutherford stood in the cramped, poorly lit hallway of her building. He looked utterly out of place, his expensive suit jarring against the peeling paint and worn linoleum. He looked tired, haggard, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. "Sophie," he said, his voice quiet. "Can I come in?" She hesitated, then opened the door wider. He stepped inside his large frame, seeming to shrink the already small room. His eyes swept over the stacks of books, the equations scribbled on a whiteboard, the telescope pointed out the window. He was seeing her world, her real world, for the first time. "It wasn't your code," he said, getting straight to the point. "It was sabotage. A malicious data packet was injected into the telemetry for Helios 7. It was designed to trigger the failure in the simulation." Sophie stared at him, processing the information. A wave of relief washed over her, so potent it made her feel dizzy, but it was followed by a cold flash of anger. "And you assumed it was my mistake?" "Yes," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I did. And I was wrong. I was under pressure, and I reverted to my worst instincts. I let my suspicion of the unknown override the data. And you were the unknown factor. There is no excuse for what I said or for how I treated you. I am truly sorry." The apology was raw and unflinching. It was the same directness he applied to his business dealings. But this time, it was aimed at acknowledging his own failure. "We caught the person who did it," he continued. "It was Peterson, my head of engineering. Lorraine Vance got to him, offered him a fortune and a directorship at Vance Dynamics. He confessed everything. The betrayal was staggering, but it all made sense." "So what now?" Sophie asked, her arms crossed. "Now Vance is making her final move." Declan said, his expression grim. "The DoD has given me until tomorrow at noon to present a viable working model. If I can't, the Helios contract goes to Vance Dynamics by default. She thinks she's already won. She sabotaged the project, and I drove away the one person who could fix it." He took a step closer. "I was wrong about you, Sophie. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. I don't just need your mind to solve this problem. I need you to trust me again. And I know I haven't given you any reason to." He wasn't commanding her. He was asking, pleading. The billionaire titan was stripped bare of his arrogance, showing a vulnerability she never thought possible. Sophie looked around her small apartment. This was her safe place, the world she controlled. Going back with him meant re-entering the chaos, the high-stakes world of corporate warfare. But the problem was still unsolved. The puzzle was still waiting for its final piece. And deep down, the part of her that yearned to solve the universe's greatest mysteries couldn't resist. "The saboteur's code," she said, her mind already shifting back into analytical mode. "It gives us an advantage." Declan looked at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "How Lorraine Vance thinks she's crippled our simulation, but she's also shown us her hand. We know her method. She attacks the input data, not the system itself. We can use that. We can build a countermeasure." The energy in the room shifted. They weren't a billionaire and an ex-waitress anymore. They were partners again. They returned to the tower immediately. The building was a ghost town, save for a skeleton crew of the most loyal engineers, and Gabriel, who greeted Sophie with a respectful nod. The plan was audacious. They wouldn't just fix the simulation. They would turn the tables on Lorraine Vance. While one team worked on scrubbing the malicious code and rerunning the successful simulation, Sophie and Declan worked on something new. "She'll try again," Sophie reasoned. "During the live presentation to the DoD, she'll have a hacker try to corrupt the live data feed. We have to anticipate it." Working side by side, their earlier synergy returned stronger than ever. They designed a ghost system, a secondary analytical layer that would run parallel to the main model. Its sole purpose was to analyze the incoming telemetry in real time for any sign of tampering, any data point that deviated from the model's predictions. It would not only identify the attack, but could trace its digital signature back to the source. They worked through the night, a frantic, caffeine-fueled race against time. As the sun rose over the city, casting long shadows across the control room, they were finally done. At 11 a.m., the video conference with the Department of Defense generals and Lorraine Vance began. Declan, looking calm and collected, started the presentation. He explained the initial setback, framing it as a hostile stress test of their security protocols. Then he launched the live demonstration. On one screen, the Helios constellation moved in perfect, predictable harmony. On another, Sophie's ghost system silently monitored the data streams. Halfway through the presentation, it happened. A tiny red alert flickered on Sophie's screen. A new data packet originating from an external IP was attempting to alter the feed for Helios 11. The ghost system instantly isolated the malicious code, neutralized it, and most importantly, traced it. "And one final feature, generals," Declan said, his voice like ice, a predatory smile touching his lips. Our system's integrated security can identify and trace any attempt at external interference in real time. He brought the trace data up on the main screen. The IP address was displayed in bold white letters. Beside it was its registered location, a server farm owned and operated by Vance Dynamics. The line went silent. Lorraine Vance's face, visible in her small window on the conference call, froze in a mask of pure fury and shock. She had been caught exposed in front of her prize client. One of the generals cleared his throat. "Mr. Rutherford, we are most impressed with your security measures. The contract is yours." The call ended. The control room erupted in cheers. Declan ignored them all. He turned and looked at Sophie, who was watching him with a small, tired smile. He walked over to her, his expression serious. "You did it." "We did it," she corrected him. He reached out, and for the first time his touch was not accidental. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. "I'm offering you a permanent position," he said. "Head of the new Astrophysical Analytics Division. You can name your salary. You can write your own ticket." Sophie smiled. "I have one condition." "Anything." "The company has to fund a new wing for the Northwood University Physics Department and create a full scholarship program for underprivileged students in STEM fields." Declan looked at her, and the last remnants of the cold, arrogant billionaire melted away. He saw not just a brilliant mind, but a good heart. He saw a woman who hadn't forgotten where she came from, even when she was staring into the cosmos. "Done," he said without hesitation. He then lowered his voice. "I have a condition of my own." "What's that?" "Have dinner with me tonight. No wine." Sophie laughed, a real, genuine laugh. "I think I can agree to that." Their journey hadn't started with a fairy tale meeting, but with a collision of worlds, an act of arrogance, and a splash of red wine. But on a napkin, Sophie had written an equation, and in doing so, she had solved for more than just a satellite's orbit. She had solved for the hidden variables in a man's heart, and in the process had changed the trajectory of both their lives forever. And so a moment of arrogance born from a spilled glass of wine became the unlikely start of an unbreakable partnership. Sophie's story proves that true worth is measured not by a uniform, but by intelligence and integrity. Declan learned that the greatest assets aren't on a balance sheet, but in the people you unexpectedly find. Their journey is a powerful reminder to never underestimate anyone, because you never know who holds the equation that can change your entire world. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by hitting the like button, sharing it with a friend, and subscribing for more unforgettable tales. Let us know your favorite part in the comments below.